Hello and welcome to L2 English class. My name is Isaac. If you're preparing for the SAT or you just want to improve your writing skill, then this class is for you. In today's lesson, I'm going to teach you how to use punctuation marks in writing and in reading. Punctuation marks are very important because they enable us to write without making our ideas confusing. And in reading as well, without punctuation marks, we might find it very difficult to understand what the writer is or what the writer has written. So these punctuation marks are not just used for decoration, they actually perform important function in writing and reading. And for those who are preparing for SAT, there are going to be a couple of questions on this convention of standard English. And some of the questions you answer under the convention of standard English will test your understanding of punctuation marks. Some of the most commonly tested punctuation marks on the SAT test, on the SAT, are the comma, colons, semicolons, and sometimes you get hyphens, question marks, and apostrophes. But I'm going to focus on the most commonly used punctuation marks, especially on the SAT. And let's start with comma. So you can see here a sign of the comma. This is a comma here. And the comma is one of the most commonly used punctuation marks in writing, actually. So what are the functions of this comma? One, a comma is used to separate items in a list. I think this is the function that many people know. If you have a list of items, you use comma to separate these items in a list. But other than that, you can also use a comma to separate or to bring together a subordinate and a main clause. So if your subordinate clause is coming at the beginning, then you have to use a comma to separate it at the point where it joins the main clause. Remember, your subordinate clause cannot stand on its own to express a complete thought, so it has to depend on the main clause. So there has to be a comma separating the subordinate clause from the main clause. That is, if the subordinate clause is coming first. If the main clause is coming first, then there is no comma. You don't need to put a comma in that case. For example, this is the subordinate clause down to this point. When the people had all assembled, that is a subordinate clause. Then the main clause is here. From here down to this point is your main clause. The chief gave his final speech. So when the people had all assembled, the chief gave his final speech. But if the main clause is coming first, then your sentence will read this way. The chief gave his final speech when the people had all assembled. In that case, you're not going to put a comma at all because the main clause is coming first. But if you have the subordinate clause coming first, then it has to be a comma when the subordinate clause joins the main clause. And you can see other examples. Whenever you hear the bell ring, know that the time is over. So this one is your main clause. This one is the subordinate clause. If you don't come early, the school bus will leave you behind. So if you don't come early is the subordinate clause. So there has to be a comma before the main clause. All right. So what else? Comma is also used to separate an introductory phrase at the beginning of a main clause, and you can use a comma to separate a supplementary phrase at the end of the main clause. And what do I mean by that? Your introductory phrase could be maybe an adverbial phrase, a prepositional phrase, or a participial phrase. The kind of a brief introduction you get before the main clause. For example, you have in the year 1987. This is an introductory phrase. So you separate it or you cut it off from the main clause. This is your main clause. The world witnessed a lot of remarkable events. So this is the main clause. The world witnessed a lot of remarkable events. Then this one here is a supplementary phrase coming at the end of the main clause. Both natural and man-made. So you're going to separate the introductory phrase and the supplementary phrase at the end of the main clause using commas. And that's another important function of a comma. You can see an example here, another example here. After a long day at work, the man returned home to rest. So this is the main clause. The man returned home to rest is the main clause. And you see the main clause. After a long day at work is an introductory phrase. So you separate it using a comma. Okay. And you can see other examples here. Okay, this one is a supplementary phrase at the end of the main clause. Lions are the top predators on the savannah, but their cubs are born blind and feeble, making them vulnerable to other predators. So making them vulnerable to other predators is a supplementary phrase at the end of a clause, a main clause. So you separate it using a comma. In 1637, the price of tulips skyrocketed in Amsterdam, with single bulbs of rare variety selling for up to the equivalent of $200,000 in today's US dollars. Okay, so this is the main clause. The price of tulips skyrocketed in Amsterdam. So this is an introductory phrase. Then this one here down to this point is a supplementary phrase. So you separate that from the main clause using a comma. And you can see other examples, more examples. So apart from separating introductory phrase and supplementary phrase at the end, at the beginning and the end of our main clause, you can also use a comma plus a coordinating conjunction to bring together two independent clauses. You can use a comma plus a coordinating conjunction to bring together two independent clauses. Remember, the first example about clauses, I said you can use a comma to bring a subordinate clause and a main clause. That is, if the subordinate clause is coming at the beginning. Now, if you want to bring together two independent clauses, then you will have to use a coordinating conjunction in addition to the comma. Let's get example. This is a coordinating conjunction. But plus this comma, you have comma plus but, and then this is a main clause or an independent clause. This is also a clause, an independent clause. So you have a compound sentence here. Your sentence reads, everybody is talking, but no one is listening. So you have two independent clauses, and you're going to bring them together using a comma plus a coordinating conjunction. Now, what are the coordinating conjunction? You have the fanboys. The acronym fanboys will help you recall easily the coordinating conjunctions. And I have the examples here of all the 7 coordinating conjunctions. So here is another one. So is also a coordinating conjunction. So you use so plus your comma to bring together these independent clauses. You also have or. This is another coordinating conjunction, or plus your comma. Yet is another one. You have yet. Yet is also a coordinating conjunction. For is also a coordinating conjunction. So you can use it. You can use for. And is also a coordinating conjunction. And you have nor. This is also a coordinating conjunction. So all of these examples are two independent clauses put together with a coordinating conjunction and a comma. So this is one way you can use a comma in writing. Okay. Another way you can use a comma is to separate a participial phrase from the main clause. A participial phrase is a phrase that has a verb in a participial form as the head word. So if your verb ends in the ing or en or the ed form for the regular verbs, and these verbs are not finite verbs because they don't actually have a subject, or they don't actively relate with the subject of the sentence. They're basically used as adjectives. So if you have a verb in the participial form, then that verb functions basically as an adjective. If you have a participial phrase, it means the head word of that phrase is a participial verb. And you can see a couple of examples here. Now, if the participial phrase is coming at the beginning of the main clause, or at the beginning of the sentence, before it joins the main clause, you have to put a comma. Another thing you need to know about a participial phrase is that it functions basically as a modifier. So it is supposed to be placed next to the noun that it modifies. The participial phrase and the noun or the pronoun that the phrase modifies must be placed side by side. So, if the participial phrase is coming at the beginning of the sentence, then there should be a comma before it joins the noun or the main clause. You can also put the participial phrase after the noun. So in that case, your participial phrase will come between the noun and the verb of the subject. Then you will have to use two commas to separate the participial phrase. So let's see examples. Running through the forest. This is a participial phrase. Running through the forest. The deer looked graceful. So the deer looked graceful is the main clause. This participial phrase is simply modifying the deer. It's simply qualifying or giving us more information about the deer. So it has to be next to the deer. Shocked by the news, she dropped her phone. So who was shocked by the news? She. So the participial phrase here is simply giving us more information about she, which is the pronoun, and there has to be a comma before the noun. And sometimes the participial phrase will come after the noun. For example, the book, this is the noun. Written by an expert, this is the participial phrase, explains everything. So, written by an expert is simply describing the book, but of course, it has to be next to the book. And in this case, you need to use two commas to cut out the participial phrase. Remember, the participial phrase is simply a modifier. That means even if you take it away, your main clause will still stand and the meaning will be intact. You can simply read, the book explains everything. That is your main clause. The participial phrase is simply giving us more information about the book. All right. So how else can you use a comma? You can also use a comma to separate non-restrictive appositive noun phrases. An appositive is simply a noun phrase or a noun that renames another noun. For example, my brother, a talented footballer. So, who is your brother? A talented footballer. Who is a talented footballer? My brother. So, my brother is a talented footballer. This is an appositive phrase. A talented footballer is an appositive phrase. It's simply renaming my brother. So, I use commas to separate this appositive phrase. Lagos, the largest city in Africa. So, what is the largest city in Africa? Lagos. So, the largest city in Africa is simply renaming Lagos. Take note, sometimes the appositive will be essential. If the appositive is essential, such a way that it will, if you take it away or you cut it away using commas, the meaning of your clause will be affected. Then you don't have to use a comma to separate it. You only separate the non-essential appositives. So, for example, you can say, the author J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter. The author, J.K. Rowling, wrote Harry Potter. You don't need to separate J.K. Rowling from the author because it is um, an essential appositive. It has to be together. But you can use a comma, for example, if your sentence read this way. J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter. In that case, you can say J.K. Rowling, comma, the author of Harry Potter. Then you can use a comma to separate the appositive from the subject or the noun phrase. All right. Another way you can use comma is to separate address. When there is a direct address, you can use a comma to separate the name of the person being addressed. For instance, Lisa, can you pass the salt? I told you, John, not to touch that. So here there's a direct address to John, and then you use commas to separate the name. You can also use a comma to separate non-essential relative clauses. A relative clause, just like a participial phrase, functions as an adjective or a modifier. And if the relative clause is not essential, then you can use a comma to separate it from the noun. And since you have the relative clause almost always coming in the middle between your noun and the verb of your clause, you always have to use two commas. For example, the car, which was just repaired, broke down again. So, which was just repaired is a relative clause giving us more information about the car. Now, relative clauses are easy to identify. A relative clause simply starts with a relative pronoun. So you have the which, who, whose, that, whom. These are the main head words of a relative clause, or you can call it adjectival clause. My brother, who is in Lagos, is coming to visit this weekend. So who is in Lagos is simply describing my brother, or modifying, rather, giving us more information about my brother. You use commas to separate the non-essential relative clause from the main clause. Okay, how else can you use a comma? There are other ways you can use a comma. Maybe when you're writing address, your location, and when you're writing dates, for example, you separate the date and the month from the year. You can use a comma to separate the date and the month from the year. You can also use a comma to separate address if you're writing giving your location or your residential address, for example. And then there are other ways too you can use a comma, but I choose to focus on those functions of comma that are very common and you're most likely going to find them on the SAT. So these are some of the common functions of comma that you're likely going to get, especially if you're sitting for the SAT. Now, I have a quick exercise for you. Let's look at this. I have a short text here, and I'd like you to take a moment to read through this text carefully and see how the punctuation marks are used. First, you have an introductory phrase here. This is an introductory phrase in 1453. This is your main clause. You have your main clause here down to this point. Okay. In 1453, English King Henry VI became unfit to rule after falling gravely ill. This is another introductory phrase. As a result, Parliament appointed Richard. Okay, and that is the main clause. Then you have an appositive here. Parliament appointed Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and then there's a relative clause. There's a relative clause here. To rule as Lord Protector. So, as a result, that is an introductory phrase, Parliament appointed Richard. That is the main clause. 3rd Duke of York. That is an appositive. Just renaming Richard. Who is Richard? 3rd Duke of York. And then there is a relative clause qualifying the 3rd Duke of York. This 3rd Duke of York had a strong claim to the English throne. So, your main clause is from here down to this point and here. Don't forget, appositives and relative clauses, participial phrases basically function as modifiers. That means you can take them away, but your main clause will still stand and the meaning will be intact. That means you can simply take away all of these parts. No, you take away this part down to this point. Okay. So if you take away all of these, good. If you take away all of that, your clause will still stand. Your main clause will still stand. So your main clause will simply be Parliament appointed Richard to rule as Lord Protector. That is your main clause. Every other thing in between is just giving us more information, just modifiers or qualifiers. And the first modifier we'll have is an appositive phrase, and then we have a relative clause, and you can see how the commas are used to cut all of these various structures. Okay, this is getting a bit, let me take this out. Good. So down here we have upon recovery 2 years later. This is a participial phrase. Upon recovery 2 years later, you have your comma. So who recovered 2 years later? Who recovered 2 years later? That's Henry. So this is the noun, and this is a participial phrase modifying or qualifying Henry, which is the noun, and this has to be a comma. There has to be a comma here to separate the participial phrase. Upon recovery, 2 years later, Henry resumed his reign. And then we have another supplementary phrase down here, down to this point. And there has to be a comma to separate the supplementary phrase from the main clause. Okay, so the text is very short, but it has a lot of grammatical structures, and you can see how the punctuation marks are used to separate all of these structures. This will make it easier for you to understand what the writer is trying to say. So the information here will come out clearer and easier to comprehend because of this punctuation. Okay, let's look at semicolons. Semicolons are not very popular, but they also serve important function in writing. I have three main functions of semicolon here, and I think these are the most fundamental functions of semicolon. One, a semicolon is used to bring together two related independent clauses. You use a semicolon to connect two independent relative main clauses rather. If you have main clauses or independent clauses that are related, you can use a semicolon to bring them together. Don't forget, you can also use a comma plus a coordinating conjunction to connect two independent clauses. But when these independent clauses are closely related, then you can simply use a semicolon. If you're using a semicolon, you don't have to add a coordinating conjunction. Just the semicolon will do. Let's look at examples. Here we are. You have, I wanted to go for a walk. It started raining. So these are two independent clauses, and instead of using a coordinating conjunction, you can simply use a semicolon to connect these clauses, these independent clauses. Remember, it has to be independent clauses. Okay, this is another example. You have a semicolon here. This semicolon is simply bringing together two independent clauses. Now, what are the clauses? You have, this is the main clause from here down to this point, and there's another main clause from here down to this point. Now, if you look at this text carefully, you will also notice that there is an introductory phrase here, and then there's a comma separating the introductory phrase. You have your main clause down to this point. So there's going to be a semicolon, and you have yet another introductory phrase. Then there's your main clause down to this point, and then you have a supplementary phrase at the end of the main clause. So this supplementary phrase is cut out using a comma. Okay, so for semicolons, you simply use semicolons when you want to bring together two independent clauses that are closely related. You can also use a semicolon plus a conjunctive adverb to bring together two independent clauses. Okay, you can use a semicolon plus a conjunctive adverb or a transitional word to bring together two independent clauses. Now, what is a conjunctive adverb? Example, there are a lot of examples of conjunctive adverb, some of which are however, therefore, hence, in fact, consequently, although, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of conjunctive adverbs. You can just look them up. You can go to the internet and look at some examples of conjunctive adverbs. If you use a conjunctive adverb plus a semicolon, then you can link together two independent clauses. These clauses must not be closely related, but they will have a relationship. And let's get an example. She did not study for the test, therefore she didn't pass. So you have she did not study for the test. Now this is the result or the effect of she not studying. She did not pass. So this is also an independent clause. And you want to bring the two of them together. You use a conjunctive adverb. So you have a semicolon here plus your conjunctive adverb to connect these two independent clauses. So apart from this, you can also use a semicolon to separate items in a complex list. Remember, you can use a comma to separate items in a list. But sometimes you have a list that is complex. That is, you're going to get a list that will have commas, or you can have a list that has sub-list. And you have to use maybe commas to separate the sub-list. In that case, you will have to use semicolon to separate the main list. So you separate the major list from the sub-list using semicolon, while the items in the sub-list can be separated using commas. For instance, on our trip, we visited Paris, France, Rome, Italy, and Berlin, Germany. So you're using the semicolons to separate one country from another country, while you're using the commas to separate a city from the country of that city. Here's another example. Using natural debris such as dry leaves, man-made trash such as plastic bags, and more traditional art supplies such as tree glue. So you have these semicolons separating the main debris, this natural debris. The natural debris are leaves, dried leaves. The man-made trash are the plastic bags. Then the more natural art supplies are tree glue. So you have different categories, and these categories also have punctuations, that is commas. So if you just use commas all through, it's going to be confusing. So you have to use semicolons to separate the main category from the subcategory. Okay, how about column? Um, Columns are also very useful. They can be used in different ways, but the most common function of a column rather is to introduce a list or to emphasize or to give to elaborate or give further explanation. If you say something and you want to emphasize that particular point you're making, you can just use a column to introduce the emphasis or whatever you want to say. After the column will just serve to emphasize what you've said earlier. Or if you want to give more explanation on what you have said earlier, then you will use a column. So whatever comes after the column could simply be defining or giving further explanation of what you have said earlier. Let's take let's get these examples. We have this. You need to bring the following items. So you need to bring the following items. Remember, your column should come at the end of your clause. Your column should come at the end of your main clause. It shouldn't be in the middle of the clause. So whatever list you want to introduce should be at the end of the main clause. In that case, you can use a column. One thing you can also take note of is the fact that the list or whatever list you're introducing after your main clause must be hinted on in the clause itself. For instance, I may say something like this. I have 3 favorite colors. Then I will put my column. Green, blue, and brown. I have 3 favorite colors. Column, green, blue, and brown. But I won't say I have column, green, blue, and brown colors. No, because the column will be in the middle of my clause and that will not be appropriate. So your column should come at the end of the main clause if you want to introduce a list. So you can have your list at the end of the main clause, then you can introduce that list using a column. A column can also introduce an explanation, definition, or an elaboration of the idea you've mentioned before. Good. So here's an example. He had only one hobby. So what is that one hobby that he had? Collecting rare coins. She got what she wanted. And what is it that she wanted? A second chance. Okay. You can have yes, you can use a column also to introduce a quote or a general saying. Now, this is a quote, you're quoting someone, and remember the quote too must be at the end of the clause. The teacher reminded us of the saying. Now, what is the saying? Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. So this is the saying, you're simply quoting the teacher. So you use your column and you then introduce the quote. Okay, you can also use a colon to lay emphasis. You want to emphasize a particular point, you can use a colon. She had one goal. She had one goal. And what is that goal? Success. So this was her goal. There was only one option left. And what was the option? Surrender. So this is to lay emphasis. Alright, so now you know. These are some of the most common ways you can use your punctuation marks. How to use your comma, semicolons, and colons. This is going to be very useful, especially for those who are sitting for the SAT. You're going to get a lot of questions in the reading and writing section of the test that will test your understanding of these punctuation marks. And if you understand how well to use the punctuation marks, all of those questions are going to be very, very easy for you. All right, so don't forget, you can always add your contribution if you have other functions of commas, colons, and semicolons, and hyphens that I didn't cover here. You can put them in the comment, and then you can also use these punctuation marks now in your writing. I believe if you have to write now, you'll be able to make your writing or your ideas clearer by using some of these punctuation marks. Thank you.